First of all, this video is not encouraging violence. I do not want anyone to become a terrorist. In fact, the exact opposite. If there's one thing that the government is good at, if there's one thing this incompetent government is good at, it's violence. So if you're violent, they respond with violence. They know how to deal with violence. And in a sense, they might want you to get violent because then they can do whatever they want to you. That's a point I'll get back to. But the title of the video, how to create a domestic terrorist. If you were going to go about creating a domestic terrorist, what would you do? If for some crazy reason you wanted to create a domestic terrorist and you were in a position of power to do so, some of the things that I think you might do is force people to lose their jobs. People get really desperate when they lose their jobs. In fact, male suicide is extremely correlated with job loss in midlife. And suicide is just one iteration of just feeling like there's no way out. So it stands to reason that another iteration of this sort of mental illness would be to become a terrorist. So that would be one step, is to create massive job losses. And, you know, I suppose you could do that in a number of ways. You could mandate that everybody inject themselves with something that you know that about half the population doesn't want to do. And then what you could do is tell them all they're crazy for being skeptical of a lying, scummy government that can't be trusted at all. But for some reason, when they don't trust them, you tell them that they're crazy. You gaslight them. So I actually have a whole video on this. I'll link to it if you want to go and check it out. It's how the government literally drives people crazy. And it gets back to this idea of, you know, the angsty teenager, the teenager that rebels against their parents. That's a modern phenomenon based on society restricting teenagers more and more. That's not like hormones or whatever. That's authoritarianism. The more authoritarian a society gets, the more anger, lashing out, and mental illness that you're going to have in that society. And that's basically what we've seen. People talk about, you know, mass shootings, the suicide epidemic. They don't think about this authoritarian society, aggressive, telling you what to do, dictating every aspect of your life, that maybe that has a little something to do with this higher prevalence of mental illness, certain types of mental illness in society. So, you know, that's one thing that you could do, is just create an extremely authoritarian society. And when people say, you know, I think we should have a freer society, you say, you're a crazy person. You're a crazy person for saying that there's anything wrong with an authoritarian, tyrannical government. Maybe you exacerbate class or racial divides in order to stoke a lot of anger in society. Maybe you give special privileges to some groups and don't give them to other groups, and that creates a lot of anger. Maybe the entire economy is just dragged down by government regulation to such an extent that the class divides even more. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Not from free market capitalism. What's that? Maybe when you lock people down for the better part of a year and prevent them from doing business or holding a job or going to work, maybe the richest corporations get way richer. Maybe Amazon keeps delivering and keeps doing business online, and the brick and mortars aren't able to do that. Maybe the restaurants, which are primarily small businesses, are the first to go under, and the bigger organizations, the chains which can deliver food, do just fine. And maybe that wealth continues to concentrate because of government actions in the upper classes, and the lower classes feel like they're getting left out. Maybe you make it even more systemic than that if you want to create some domestic terrorists. Maybe your entire financial system is based on this idea that the government will keep printing money, and the money in your bank account will be worth less. A backdoor tax. Here's the Federal Reserve printing money. Your money's worth less. Rents are going up. It's not keeping up. Wages aren't keeping up with inflation. That's a great way to create a domestic terrorist. It's a great way to create mass suicide in a society. It's a great way to create more mental illness, to make people hate their lives, fight with each other. And go figure, this is a lot of the things that we're seeing in society right now. Except what's sad, I was going to say hilarious, but none of this is hilarious. What's sad is that the government claims to want to prevent domestic terrorism. They're doing all these things right now that they say are going to prevent domestic terrorism. They've opened up this hotline, this website, so that you can report your friends and family who might be radicalizing. And they say that's going to prevent domestic terrorism. So you're a guy, you're a normal guy, maybe you like some guns, maybe you're pissed off at the government, maybe you believe in the founding fathers, and somebody goes, I think that makes you a domestic terrorist. That's like when somebody says, you know, what's wrong? You're like, nothing's wrong. And they're like, no, something's wrong. What's wrong? You're like, nothing's wrong. And you get annoyed, and now something's wrong because they keep asking you what's wrong. That's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. Why are you acting crazy, man? Why are you acting so crazy? So I don't want to say they're trying to create domestic terrorists, right? I think that's giving the government a little bit too much credit. I think you can still explain most of the things going on with basic incompetence, unintended consequences, although there's definitely some evil people in there. There's definitely some scumbags at the top. I think it's probably more like organized crime than a vast conspiracy to control over us. I really don't think they're that competent, and I think part of what they project is this confidence and this overbearing power and, you know, control, when you have to remember that the government is incompetent. Well, but the one thing that they're good at is using violence. So if there was somebody that wanted to control citizens but doesn't really have a way to do it, what you want is to push them and push them and push them until they act out violently. And then as soon as the citizen that you couldn't do anything with before, that you couldn't attack or prosecute before, gets violent, the hammer comes down and you can charge them as terrorists. I'm just reading here that they're expanding. The FBI is going to get hundreds of millions of extra dollars. They're going to hire new agents, and they're gonna be looking more into domestic terrorism. Now, something you might not know about the FBI is that the way that it gets a lot of its prosecutions is actually by enticing people to commit these crimes. Now, again, you could get really sinister and say that this is a really messed up plan from the top to control people, or you could look at the more simple solution and say they want to boost their numbers, they want to prove that they're getting funded for a reason, and the more domestic terrorists that they catch, the more they can justify their funding and their power, all their snooping powers, all their policing powers. But the problem is there just aren't that many actual real domestic terrorists. As scary as they try to make the world out to be, most people, it takes a lot to make them that crazy. So what the FBI tends to do, and this is documented, I'm not like making this up, you can read this in case after case, is that they'll go out and they'll usually find somebody that's already a little bit mentally ill. You know, they might not be the smartest person, and they might be running their mouth about, you know, I hate the government, I hate this, whatever. And then this undercover agent slides in and says, you know, I agree with you. What if we did this? And the FBI actually supplies the entire terrorist plot. They supply the weapons, they supply the plans to people that probably wouldn't be capable or willing to do this otherwise. That's the Whitmer kidnapping case that you might have heard about. That was orchestrated by the FBI. So if you're the type of person, and I don't blame you, if you like to get together with the bros and shoot some guns and drink some beer, at some point you're going to be like, F the government, you know, we should do this, we should do that, whatever. In the spirit of the revolution, remember, the government loves violence. They're good at violence. If they get you to commit violence, then you're in their turf. You're on their turf, you're on their playing field, and they're probably going to beat you. I found this meme the other day that has a great little song, a little rhyme I liked to remind you what to look out for when that new buddy of yours starts talking a little crazy. If he'll drive you to the criming, he's a Fed. If he'll drive you to the criming, he's a Fed. If you can't get there without him and you don't know much about him, if he'll drive you to the criming, he's a Fed. If his friends got the weapons, he's a Fed. If his friends got the weapons, he's a Fed. If you're running off your mouth and his buddy lives down south, if his friends have got the weapons, he's a Fed. If he's got a stupid haircut, he's a Fed. If he's got a stupid haircut, he's a Fed. If his haircut's tight and high, if it's better with a suit and tie, if he's got a stupid haircut, he's a Fed. I just like a short haircut. I'm not a Fed. If he says you don't need OPSEC, he is a Fed. Operations Security. If he says you don't need OPSEC, he is a Fed. If he wants you to repeat it, where the chat room won't delete it, if he says you don't need OPSEC, he's a Fed. But, you know, this is the point, that they act like they're going to stop domestic. They're like, well, we really care about domestic terrorism, so we're going to force everybody in society into our little narrow vision of what you should be. We're going to tell you you're a piece of shit if you don't go along with it. You're crazy. You're deplorable. You're going to, you know, be a second-class citizen. We're going to put you out of a job. We're going to ruin your life. Go figure. That creates more domestic terrorists. That creates more suicides. That creates more mental illness. It creates more of everything that we're seeing in society right now, because either the government is so incompetent that they don't understand that, or there's some evil people in there pulling the strings because they want this to happen for whatever reason. And of course, that shouldn't need a whole lot of justification. There's been psychopaths in government always. That's like literally all of history is just like, yeah, that psycho was in government. Like, what motivated him? Like, power. That's power, I guess. With all this propaganda that they throw at you, it's actually having an effect on people's mental health. And so people are sicker when they're in fear and when they're stressed out. People are shut down. They don't think that they have control over their lives, so they don't try to take the initiative to make their lives better. They get depressed, they get angry, they lash out. And that's what they're doing with essentially every major meme that they push on society now. Researchers from the University of Bath say 84% of 16 to 25-year-olds surveyed are at least somewhat worried about climate change. Nearly 60% say they are very or extremely worried about the climate crisis. 75% say the future is frightening. Well, if the future's frightening, maybe the government could step in and take control over that future and help us out, and it wouldn't be so scary because we'd have like Papa Government looking after us. Now, we wouldn't have to make any of those scary choices ourselves, and we wouldn't have to worry about anything. I mean, they'll probably load us into boxcars. Another proposal I just saw from the Biden, I'll never tax anybody but a billionaire, 8 cents per mile if you want to drive. Oh, that's really going to hit the billionaires hard. It's all about you. They're aiming it at you. The guns are aimed at you. And they would love for you to become a domestic terrorist, but like I said, that puts you on their playing field. They know what to do with you. They kill you. They cage you. It doesn't end well. So what we need to be doing instead is building, innovating, building a parallel economy. I mentioned that in the last video. I'm going to actually be coming out with an entire list of all these different types of businesses that you could start, because the goal when you're creating this side economy is to, one, not rely on those main institutions, but it's also to turn a profit. There's so much new technology where you can automate a lot of this farming, and I would love to see some, nice new innovative small scale businesses where you got this setup that, yeah, it costs a few $1,000s to put in, but then you can automate, weeding and watering. Food is the most basic. There's also security. You can get Amazon security who's going to put the Ring camera on, the front of your house, and then it's going to monitor you and give that information directly to the government, directly to the police, usually without any warrants. So if that's something you're not comfortable with, or if you think that there's a market in your area for people that don't like that, there's something called a Raspberry Pi where you can basically program all of these internet-based smart devices, but you can program it yourself and you can keep it offline. And that's important for a lot of these Internet of Things devices because they're all connected to that grid where you can be hacked and you can be subpoenaed, and the government ends up with a massive amount of information on you. My big one is education. I think that the education system is absurdly expensive. They're not educating you, they're indoctrinating you, and they're not even pumping people out into the world ready to earn a good living. So that's something that there's enough information online where you really don't need college at all these days. But it does help to have the social environment and to have a mentor to learn from and to structure that learning. That's the one that I'm going to be working on. That's one of those institutions. That's what I'm trying to build the parallel economy for. But there's a million different things that you could do. Just get a little bit creative and think, how can I take a little bit of market share away from these giant corporations, giant institutions that are very untrustworthy, something that's going to be useful for the community but also profitable to me. And those things ideally should match. The amount of profit you make should match the amount of service you provide for the community. I started listing some of these off because, like I said, I'm putting together a much bigger, more clear and laid out path to how to do this, how to build this parallel economy. And what it focuses on is like a little micro society. You want people around you that share your values, that share your lifestyle, that are going to be able to help you in an emergency, that are productive, that are capable, that you can trade with. So I wrote down a bunch of these. So off-grid outfitting. So the power grid, the water grid, these things are vulnerable, especially in worst case scenarios. So if you can install solar panels and batteries for people, if you can install a water collection system, that's a great parallel economy business. You're providing a very valuable service and equipment to people, and you're helping them be more reliant on themselves and less reliant on these centralized institutions. Classes, anything education is so doable these days. Hold classes, I would love to see a food forest architect, landscaper, where you're creating these systems which ideally, once you get them to the right point, are self-replicating, and it acts like a forest, except that you've planted all food items in that forest. So then for generations, you can just walk out your door and pick food. That's a pretty good way to not be so dependent on anything outside of your backyard. Of course, banks and currency is a giant one, and cryptocurrency I do think has a ton of potential there, but that's not necessarily the only solution. There's websites that have been created where people can trade labor or goods. There's other systems that you could put in place, like smart contracts, where you don't necessarily need to transact with that currency medium. We can provide these really robust, anti-fragile institutions or alternatives to the large institutions on a small scale. And when things go really bad, that's when you profit the most. As long as you can keep that going, you can consolidate your market, you'll expand your services. And when people realize like, oh, I really need this now. I couldn't trust the government. Those institutions have collapsed. They've excluded me now because I didn't get my 27th booster. So now, a person who complied with the first 26 shots is suddenly out, and they need a place to get food or whatever. The point is, get creative with this parallel economy. And like I said, subscribe, hit that little notification bell so that you're notified anytime new content comes out. Throw me a comment, throw me a like, because there's so much more to talk about. There's so much we can do. There's so much that's under our control. Thank you for watching. I'm Joe Jarvis. Come back and see me again soon.